They said the crypt was sealed in 1892, yet a hymn was heard from inside last winter. The caretaker swore he saw no one enter, but the voices rose anyway. It was not a hymn anyone remembered, but all who heard could hum the refrain. They called it a forgotten song, and it never ended where it began. A single road cutting through fields of withered grass. A church spire rising at the center of a small village. The air feels muted. Even the crows circling above seem strangely quiet. This was St. Hildegard's parish, northern England. The year was 1879. It was the kind of place where time felt stuck between seasons, where stone walls sagged beneath the weight of moss, and the graveyard lay so close to the chapel doors it seemed no one ever left its shadow. Inside that parish, there had been children, a choir of 12. They were known throughout the countryside for their voices, thin, untrained, yet rising in an innocence that made farmers pause in their fields and travelers stop in the lane outside the chapel. The choir was led by the vicar's sister, a woman named Margaret Ashcroft, a schoolteacher by trade, a stern but patient hand with the children. On the evening of November 3rd, she called rehearsal. It was not unusual. Advent was approaching, and the parish prepared for its small procession. But something was different that night. Several parents recalled later that Margaret's notice had come quickly. She had passed through the market that morning, telling each family that practice would be held without delay. No one remembered seeing her carry her hymn book. Still, the children gathered. They were seen entering the chapel around dusk, their small figures slipping between gravestones, scarves tied against cold, their laughter rising briefly before being swallowed by the stone doorway. That was the last time they were seen. When night fell and the lamps in the parish windows extinguished, the children did not return. At first, it seemed a mistake. Parents waited with shawls pulled tight, calling softly into the lane. But silence met them. The chapel was dark. The door was locked. By midnight, panic had settled. Men carried lanterns into the fields. Women searched the lanes and hedgerows. Yet no one thought to enter the chapel, because the vicar insisted, firmly, almost angrily, that no choir had been scheduled. He repeated it again and again, to every mother who pressed at his doorstep, to every father who demanded the keys. His voice trembled with authority, but his hands shook as he spoke. There was no practice tonight, he told them. You are mistaken. But the villagers were not mistaken, and by dawn, 12 families were broken. The first searches were clumsy, desperate, shouting into the woods, beating at hayricks with sticks, pulling open barn doors in the fields beyond. They found nothing. No shoe in the mud. No shawl snagged on a fence post. Only silence. By the second day, word had spread beyond the parish. Men on horseback came from neighboring towns. Constables combed the countryside. Still, the vicar insisted. No choir. No rehearsal. And then came the sound. It was a week later. On the 11th of November, a farmer returning from the fields reported hearing voices, thin, childlike, rising from beneath the graveyard. At first he thought it was wind across the stones, but the melody was distinct, a hymn he had heard in service. Others soon heard it too. At night, when the mist lay low, faint singing drifted through the churchyard, always the same, a harmony without words, a note held too long, then breaking into uneven breaths. And that's when they noticed the ground. The graves nearest the chapel doors seemed disturbed, not freshly dug, but as if the earth had shifted. The grass bent in a circular pattern, pressed flat though no one had walked there. Lanterns showed nothing, but the singing persisted. Margaret Ashcroft was questioned. She had not been seen since the night of the rehearsal. Her small cottage was found abandoned, fire long gone cold, her hymn book missing from the desk. Still, the vicar remained unyielding. He ordered the parish sealed. By winter, the crypt beneath St. Hildegard's was locked with iron, mortar smeared hastily across the door. Families were told there had been no choir, no practice, no children. The parish records from that year contained no names, no entries. The choir had been erased. But memory has a way of resisting. For weeks after the sealing, villagers continued to hear the voices, always at night, always from beneath the soil. Children calling in uneven unison, as if their lungs filled with dust. A mother of one of the missing boys described it years later. She said it was not singing in the way a choir sings. It was trying to sing, as though something fragile was breaking between each note. She never returned to the parish grounds again. Others spoke less. Many left the village entirely. Fields were abandoned, the lane overgrown. Within a generation, St. Hildegard stood nearly alone. But there is one account that survives. A stonemason, hired to repair the parish wall in the spring of 1880, claimed he was given access to the crypt. The vicar told him to reinforce the seal, to ensure no one might enter. The mason refused to record what he saw. He left the village that same week, never collecting his pay. But his son recalled a sentence his father muttered each night in his final years, a whisper before sleep. They were standing, he said. Every one of them was standing. The vicar of St. Hildegard's was replaced quietly in 1882. No reason was given. Margaret Ashcroft was never found. And yet, the graveyard has remained closed. Local law protects it now. No excavation, no disturbance. The land is silent, overgrown, marked only by leaning stones and the crumbling arch of the chapel wall. But travelers still say that if you stop at the road on a winter night and wait in the cold, you may hear it. A faint breath beneath the soil, a note caught between silence and memory. And if you stay long enough, if you wait without moving, it becomes clearer. The sound of children, trying to finish the hymn they never completed. The camera drifts low across a field of frost. Branches stripped bare, a ruined wall pushing out of the earth like broken teeth. Beyond it, St. Hildegard's parish, 3 decades older, its stone blackened by damp, its windows hollowed by storms. By 1911, the village around it had nearly vanished. Only a scattering of farmsteads remained, roofs sagging, doors warped with rot. Few entered the parish grounds anymore. Grass grew high against the chapel walls. The graveyard leaned in uneven rows, its stones tilting, some swallowed entirely by soil. But that year, the church was scheduled for renovation. The diocese had ordered it quietly. A letter from York, folded and sealed, instructing that St. Hildegard's would be stabilized, its walls repaired, its roof resealed. It would never return to service. But the building, they wrote, must not be left collapse. And so, in the spring of that year, workmen arrived. They were not locals. Most came from Leeds, hired in a group of 12. Men used the stone and timber, men who had lifted walls from ruin before. They brought their tools on wagons, their coats stiff with dust, their hands calloused. None of them knew the history of the place. The villagers did not speak of it. On their first morning, the workers found the yard unervingly still. No birds in the eaves, no breeze through the grass. The church itself seemed to hold the air, pressing silence outward like a tide. The foreman, a man named Joseph Larkin, ordered the crew to begin clearing the lower wall. Years of erosion had left the foundation uneven. They dug out earth, pried stones loose, carried them into piles. It was there, against the northern wall of the graveyard, that one of the men struck iron. At first they thought it was a hinge, a rusted gate buried in soil. But scraping back the mud revealed a square of stone, fitted with a rusting handle, mortar smeared thick across the seam. It was a door. The men called for the foreman. Larkin knelt beside it, brushing dirt from the surface with his sleeve. He found a faint outline of a cross carved into slab, nearly erased by time. He tapped it with his hammer. The sound rang hollow. He ordered it opened. The others hesitated. One of the younger men, Thomas Bell, remarked that the earth around the slab seemed colder, damp to the touch, even though no rain had fallen for days. Another swore he heard something shift beneath the stone as they dug. Still, Larkin insisted. With crowbars they pried at the edge until the seal cracked. Mortar gave way in sharp flakes. The door shuddered, then lifted, stone grinding against stone, and a smell rose out. It was not decay, not rot. It was a smell of wet stone, a deep mineral damp, as if the air had been trapped beneath the earth for centuries. It spread to the yard in a heavy draft, carrying a chill that made the men's eyes water. But there was something else in it too. A sound. At first, they thought it was a scrape of stone, an echo rolling back through the opening. But as they leaned closer, the noise grew clearer. A cadence, faint, uneven, drifting upward like breath through water. It was singing. The men dropped their tools. Some laughed nervously, swearing it was trick of the ear. But the melody persisted. Low voices, rising in unison, breaking, then beginning again. No words could be made out, only tone, a hymn with no language. The crew stepped back. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered. The youngest, Thomas, refused to approach again. He claimed the sound shifted when he moved, like the voices followed his steps. The foreman stood longest at the threshold, his face pale in the lamplight, his breath shallow. He told the men it was wind, that the crypt below was empty, that air alone could trick the ear when funneled through stone. But his voice shook. By dusk, the men refused to continue. They gathered their tools, muttering of ill-omened ground, of doors better left sealed. Larkin ordered them back, but few obeyed. That night, the church stood with its door uncovered, the slab ajar. Villagers said they heard the voices too, not faint, but clear, echoing across the yard, swelling beneath the chapel stones. Always the same melody, always unfinished. By morning, the workmen had not returned. Their campfires were cold, their wagons still loaded, but Larkin was missing. The men searched for him through the lanes and across the fields. No trace. His coat remained by the fire, his lantern unlit. At last they found him. He was kneeling at the crypt door, his head bowed low, his hands folded loosely before him. His lips moved, almost imperceptibly, a sound barely audible beneath his breath. He was humming, not a tune any of them knew, not a hymn carried in their memory, a melody foreign to all who listened. When they shook him, he did not answer. When they pulled him back, his knees dragged through the dirt, stiff as though bound by something unseen. He looked at none of them, only downward, always toward the opening. The men carried him to the lane, then left him to care of the villagers. None returned to the worksite. Larkin never spoke again. For the rest of his life, he hummed, not loudly, not in words, just that same low cadence, repeated in breath after breath, until his lungs gave way years later. The church was abandoned once more. The diocese made no mention of renovations, no record of workers, no note of payment, only the slab, resealed hastily in the summer that year. The parish fell further into ruin. Its roof caved, its walls cracked, the graveyard consumed by grass. But those who passed the lane in winter told the same story, that if you paused by the northern wall and waited in silence, you could still hear the faintest echo, a tune that no one knew, carried on breath that did not belong to the living. The camera lingers on the outline of the chapel ruins, grass bowing against broken stones, a roof long fallen in, the graveyard sunk unevenly, its crosses tilting, half swallowed by earth. Mist presses low, hanging across the ground like a veil. By the 1930s, St. Hildegard had become little more than a curiosity, a ruin whispered about in pubs, a place children dared each other to run past at night. But one man was drawn closer. His name was Professor Arthur Mead, a lecturer in antiquities at the University of York, known for his fascination with folklore, the kind of man who collected stories others dismissed, fragmented superstitions, half-forgotten songs, the way a community's fear could cling to a building long after its doors had closed. Mead had read about St. Hildegarde's in a rural gazette, a passing mention of voices beneath the ground, an unverified account. It was enough. He gathered equipment, primitive, heavy, but portable enough for a small expedition, a reel-to-reel phonograph, powered by a portable generator, its body encased in oak, wax discs for recording, steel needles. He arranged for a colleague to join him, but when the time came, no one did. He went alone. On a late autumn afternoon in 1932, he drove a black motorcar north along the old road, its tires spitting gravel, its headlights dim in the fog. Villagers saw him pass but gave no greeting. His arrival was not welcome. He parked at the edge of the lane, carried his cases by hand across the overgrown path, and set them down within the chapel shell. The air inside was colder. Shadows bent unnaturally, drawn inward toward the cracked flagstones. Meade noted it carefully in his journal. He wrote that the ruin smelled of damp lime and stagnant water, that no bird entered, no insect crossed the threshold. And then he wrote something else, that faintly from the far corner of the ruin, he heard a sound, not distinct, not immediate, a vibration more than a voice, a trembling in the stone. Meade arranged his equipment. He placed the phonograph near the old crypt door, still sealed, but ringed with cracks where the mortar had pulled loose. He positioned the microphone above the stone, adjusted its angle with meticulous care. He wound the machine, lowered the needle, and waited. At first, nothing, only the hiss of the wax, a flat breath of static. He noted the silence in his journal, wrote that he had expected disappointment. But then faintly it began, a murmur, rhythmic, uneven. He strained to hear, bent closer. It was not music. It was the sound of children gasping, breath pulled sharply, then released in unison. Again and again, the professor froze. His notes trembled on the page from this point onward. He described the sound as an inhalation too deep for small lungs. He wrote that it continued without pause. Dozens of voices locked in the same motion. And then beneath it, another sound emerged, the strike of a piano key, high, sharp, and singular. The same note pressed again and again, without hesitation, without rest. It did not waver, did not fade, only repeated. Meade stopped the machine, pulled the reel from its housing. His hands shook as he packed the equipment. He left the ruin in haste, abandoning tools and grass, his journal half open, ink smudged by rain. He drove through the night, returning to York before dawn. The recording, however, was not played until the following week. Students recall that he locked himself in the phonograph room, curtains drawn, lights dim. He threaded the reel, lowered the needle, and let the sound fill the chamber. They remember the look on his face. Not fear, not shock, but recognition. He sat motionless, staring at the wall, his hand resting on the phonograph table, as if steadying himself against some invisible sway. When the reel ended, he played again, then again, hour after hour. And then he left. No one saw him at the university after that evening. His office was found in disarray, books stacked haphazardly, papers scattered, his overcoat abandoned on the chair. The recording equipment was gone. Only the journal remained, its final entry written in cramped, hurried script. Not song, not prayer. They are trying to breathe. The university never filed a formal inquiry. His position was struck quietly from the rolls. Students spoke at him in whispers, but faculty dismissed the matter. And yet a rumor endured that one of the wax reels had been left behind, hidden among the archives, locked in a drawer no one dared open. No one could confirm it, but in the years that followed, a curious pattern appeared. Each autumn, when the mist lay low on the campus grounds, faint music was said to drift through the library corridors. Not a melody, not words, just a single note, pressed endlessly, ringing against silence that seemed too deep to belong to the living. The frame lingers on the outline of the cemetery, mist curling low between the stones, iron gates leaning inward, their paint stripped by decades of rain. Beyond them, the chapel ruins, roof fallen, windows hollow, walls scarred with cracks like veins spreading through old bone. By 1954, St. Hildegard's was little more than an abandoned parish. Yet the grounds were not wholly forgotten. The diocese still paid for a caretaker. His name was William Clark. He was 61, a widower. He lived in a small stone cottage at the edge of the cemetery, a single-room dwelling with a coal stove and a desk cluttered with parish forms. His duties were modest: trimming grass, clearing branches, repairing the occasional headstone. But the burden was heavier than the task, because William lived alone, and he lived beside the crypt. He had tended the grounds for nearly a decade before he reported anything unusual. A quiet man, not prone to exaggeration. Locals recalled him as deliberate, almost painfully slow in his speech, as if weighing every word before it left his mouth. But in the summer of 1954, something changed. On the evening of July 2nd, William was making his rounds, lantern in hand, his boots sinking into damp soil as he walked the narrow paths between the graves. He kept a log of his movements, written neatly in pencil on lined paper. At 9:17 he recorded, "North wall secure." At 9:23, "Gates latched." At 9:31, his handwriting falters. The line reads only, "Heard it." Later, he told neighbors that he had stopped near the old crypt door. The stone was still sealed, mortar crumbling at its edges but unbroken. He had passed it countless times without pause. But that night, he said, the air felt different, colder, and then he heard a voice. High, thin, a girl's voice. She was singing, not loudly, not clearly, but enough for him to catch the shape of a lullaby, a melody rocking gently, the kind a mother might hum over a cradle. William stood frozen, his lantern tilted against the stone. He tried to recall the tune later, but found no match. It was not a hymn, not any church melody, not even a folk song he recognized from his childhood. It was unfamiliar, and that unsettled him most of all, because the voice was young, no older than 12, and it was rising from behind the sealed slab. William swore the song continued for nearly a minute, the same refrain, repeated without falter. When it ceased, silence pressing heavy and final, like the closing of a door. He wrote in his logbook only that one broken phrase, "Heard it." In the days that followed, William changed. Villagers who passed the gate remarked that he looked pale, thinner, that his eyes seemed fixed not on them, but on something past their shoulder. When asked if he was well, he smiled faintly but spoke little. Inside his cottage, his desk grew cluttered with pages, not forms, not accounts, sheets covered in jagged script, words written phonetically, notes arranged in half-finished staves, lines of music with no measure. Neighbors recalled hearing him at night, a low murmur drifting through the open window, not speech, not song, something between, his lips moving ceaselessly as though rehearsing words he had never learned. By the 5th day, he no longer made his rounds. The grass rose unchecked. Branches littered the paths. On July 8th, a villager entered his cottage. They found William at his desk, sitting upright, his eyes open, unfocused, his lips blue. He was dead, but his mouth still moved. The witness described it with horror. Even as his body had stiffened, his jaw trembled faintly, his lips forming shapes. Not language, not prayer, something else. Words no one recognized. On the desk before him lay a single page, music scrawled in uneven lines, notes scattered without scale, a pattern repeating itself again and again. Experts would later compare it to every known hymn, every folk tune in the region, every liturgical chant. No match was ever found. The page was kept in the diocesan archive, filed without comment, the cause of death listed as natural. But among the villagers, another story endured, that William had not simply died at his desk, that he had been listening, that even in death, he was trying to follow the song. And some said that if you stood by the northern wall that summer, in the hours before dawn, you could hear a second voice rising faintly beneath the first. A man's voice, older, rougher, mouthing words no one else could understand. The camera drifts slowly over the cemetery walls, moss thick on the stones, branches bending inward as if leaning to listen. The air is heavy. Still, somewhere in the distance, the low toll of a bell carries across the valley, though no parish stands claim it. By the 1970s, St. Hildegard's had been abandoned for decades. The chapel roof collapsed, the convent dissolved, the parish records boxed and forgotten. But one man had not let it go, Father Elias Roche. He was in his late 40s then, a tall, austere priest with sharp cheekbones and a voice that never seemed to rise above a whisper. Parishioners described him as devout, almost painfully so. Others said he was restless, haunted by a conviction that the church had left something unfinished. Elias had studied the accounts. The caretaker's death in 54. The whispered stories of voices heard by the crypt. The sealed stone that no one dared to disturb. He became convinced that what lingered there was not a curse, but a hunger, and that it demanded consecration. So he planned a mass, not in the chapel, not before the altar, but inside the crypt itself. It was forbidden. The diocese had ordered the site sealed, but Elias was persuasive. He told his parishioners that it would be a private liturgy, a reclamation, that by sanctifying the crypt, they would drive away what had haunted the grounds for generations, and a dozen agreed to follow him. On the night of March 12th, they gathered by the northern wall. It was just after midnight. The air bit with frost. They carried candles hidden beneath their coats, prayer books pressed tightly to their chests. The crypt door was unsealed with a chisel. The stone groaned as it shifted, the slab leaning outward as though resisting. Behind it, the air was colder still, dry, stale, a hollow carved into the earth where no sound seemed to linger. They filed inside. It was smaller than they expected, a narrow chamber, low ceiling, the walls scarred with moisture, the ground uneven stone, flecked with salt that glittered faintly in the candlelight. Father Elias set a makeshift altar near the rear wall, just a wooden plank laid across two stones. Upon it, a chalice, a paten, and a crucifix worn smooth with age. The Mass began. At first, it was solemn, familiar, the cadence of Latin intonations rising steady in the chamber. The candles cast long shadows against the walls. Parishioners knelt in silence, their breath visible in the cold. But something wasn't right. The flames began to tremble, not as if stirred by air, but in rhythm, each candle flickering not randomly, but together, bending and swaying in time, as though guided by an invisible beat. The parishioners exchanged uneasy glances. None spoke, yet all noticed. The rhythm was steady, repeating. It was as if the flames were dancing to a song only they could hear. Father Elias did not falter. He raised the chalice, his voice firm, commanding, resonant against the stone. But those present later admitted, though they could not place the moment, that his words began to blend with something else, a second cadence, not spoken aloud, not sung, but heard. One woman described it as a tune behind the words. Another said it was like a lullaby someone was humming in another room. The candles answered it, their light pulsing in perfect measure, casting the chamber in waves of brightness and shadow. And then the parishioners felt it in their throats. A tightening, subtle at first, as if the air had thickened. Words caught in their mouths. Their own responses in the liturgy faltered, breaking into hoarse whispers. By the consecration, half of them could not speak at all, their voices gone, only air escaping their lungs. They tried to pray, tried to mouth the familiar lines. Nothing. The silence spread like a contagion. One by one, their throats closed. Their lips moved, but no sound followed. Father Elias continued alone, but even his voice began to strain. Each phrase harsher, dragged out, as though he too were resisting the weight pressing against him. And then the candles snapped. All at once, every flame blown inward, as if something had inhaled. The chamber fell black. Panic surged. Parishioners groped blindly, hands clawing at cold stone, at one another's sleeves. They could not cry out. Their voices gone. Only the scraping of boots echoed in the dark. One man later swore he felt breath on his ear, warm, close, and the faintest trace of a melody hummed against the skin. When the candles were lit again, Father Elias stood rigid at the altar, his eyes fixed on the wall, his hands trembling as though holding something unseen. He whispered the final words of the Mass, barely audible, then let the chalice fall. It struck the stone. Wine spilled like blood across the floor. No one spoke as they stumbled back into the night. By dawn, the parishioners discovered their voices had not returned. Half of them, mute, their throats raw with pain. Some regained speech within days, others within weeks. But for several, it lingered far longer, a silence that stretched into months, marked by whispers and broken syllables. No medical cause was found. The diocese condemned Father Elias. The Mass was never recorded in any ledger. The crypt resealed with new mortar. But the parishioners never forgot. Some later confessed that what frightened them most was not the loss of voice. It was the sound they never admitted hearing aloud. Because though the chamber was silent, each of them swore, in the weeks that followed, they could still recall the melody, not in memory, but in dreams. Always the same lullaby, and always unfinished. The lens drifts across a quiet room. Stacks of yellowed manuscripts. A reel-to-reel tape machine. It's real still. A desk stained with smoke, edges warped by something that once burned here. It is 1989. An ethnomusicologist named Dr. Marcus Leclerc arrived in the valley that summer. He was 49 years old, French-born, American-trained, and he had spent his career chasing songs older than memory. He called them survivor melodies, fragments of chants that endure by hiding in children's rhymes, funeral hymns, even shepherds' calls across empty hills. But here, he believed he had found something more, something unbroken. Dr. Leclerc first heard of the crypt in the journals of a missionary who had passed through the region in the 1880s. The entry was a single line. They say the stone itself sings to the soil. Leclerc dismissed it at first, but when he traced the same phrase, nearly word for word, in an account written a century earlier by a Jesuit, his interest sharpened. That phrase should not have survived, but it had. He traveled with a small kit, notebooks, pencils, a portable tape deck, and rolls of blank magnetic tape. He rented a single room above a bakery, 2 miles from the cemetery. Every evening, townsfolk saw him walking toward the stone gate with his bag slung across his shoulder. And every morning, they saw him return, eyes reddened, shirt soaked through with sweat. A man who seemed to age by hours, not years. But he kept listening. At first, he wrote in his notes that what he heard was faint, a vibration, almost below the threshold of music. Then, a thread, a pattern, a line that seemed to repeat itself. But something wasn't right. He realized the song did not end. It only folded back into itself, the way a candle flame seems still, though it is never the same fire twice. And that's when he heard it, a melody without resolution. It did not climb or fall. It did not close. It circled. He described it as a melody designed to be sung in death. That phrase appears 3 times in his notes, each time underlined, each time with the pressure of his hand cutting through the paper. By August, he had stopped meeting colleagues. He stopped visiting the bakery. The only evidence of his meals was a slow collection of crusted plates outside his door. Inside his notebooks, his handwriting grew stranger, wider loops, abrupt slashes where letters should curve, sentences that began with clarity and ended as if someone had pulled the pen across the page against his will. Still, he listened. He described nights where he could not sleep, because the melody continued behind his eyes, even when he blocked his ears with cloth, even when he held his breath. One entry reads, "It is not sung to be heard. It is sung to be remembered by the earth itself." 2 weeks later, the tape recorder stopped working. He replaced the batteries, but the reels no longer moved. When he pressed play, only silence. No hiss, no static, just nothing. And yet, he kept pressing record. Hours of silence. Dozens of reels stacked like bricks around his desk. Neighbors reported the smell of burning wood. But when they checked the chimney, there was no fire. Only ash, scattered across his windowsill. Then, one evening, he was gone. His landlord found the room deserted. No suitcase, no coat, only his notebooks, charred at the edges, as though a fire tried to erase them but stopped halfway, and the last page smeared entirely in ash. The words still legible beneath the gray film. It does not want to end. It never ends. The final reel sat in the tape deck. The landlord pressed play. Silence. But those who stood near the machine swore the silence had weight, like a held breath, like something still listening. No one ever saw Dr. Leclerc again. His notes remain in the archives of the university, sealed in a box labeled uncatalogued. The reels are still there too, stacked like silent witnesses. And though every one of them plays nothing, archivists say the magnetic tape looks warped, as if beneath its surface something is still etched, waiting. But waiting for what? No one knows. The shelves stand in rows, dust layered thick, labels faded to the color of bone. The camera moves slow, following a shaft of light across the locked door of a diocesan archive, the kind of place few ever enter, and fewer leave with answers. It is here, deep in the records of the church, that the crypt is mentioned most often, but not in sermons, not in theology, only in attempts to document what could not be named. The first files appear in the late 1700s. A parish clerk in Navarre, tasked with recording funerary rites, noted a melody he had never heard before. He called it a line without breath. He tried to write it down, black ink on parchment, but the transcription stops abruptly, the notes suspended mid-bar. He never finished the page. 2 decades later, another entry surfaces, this time from a cathedral scribe in Toledo. The handwriting is firm at first, trained in the careful curves of liturgical notation. Then, halfway down the staff, the letters break apart. The clefts skew at angles. The line fractures, and the page ends with a smudge, as if the quill had been dragged away. But something wasn't right. When archivists examined the sheet centuries later, they found something uncanny. The ink did not fade evenly. It grew darker toward the bottom of the page, as if the unfinished melody had been written not in one sitting, but in layers, over and over. And that's when they began to notice a pattern. Every attempt to transcribe the melody stopped at the same place, a mid-note break, as though the hand that guided the ink had been interrupted or had refused to continue. In 1864, a Jesuit scholar named Father Rivas spent weeks in a candlelit cell, attempting to set the crypt's sound and music. He worked by night, listening to fragments described by witnesses, marking the staff with tireless precision. His pages filled quickly, dozens of sheets stacked beside his desk, but none of them reached the final measure. Instead, his handwriting began to shift, his type. Even letters loosened into wide loops. Ink bled into erratic marks. One page shows a line of music that trails into nothing, replaced by a row of circles. Not notes, not words, just shapes, drawn until the nib of the pen tore through the parchment. And Father Rivas wrote something in the margin, a sentence that remains there still. It is no longer my hand. After this, the records fall silent for nearly 50 years, not because the phenomenon stopped, but because the files were sealed. The Vatican declared the archive restricted, the pages locked in boxes, stored in rooms with no catalog numbers. As if by hiding the paper, the sound itself could be buried, but the silence never lasted. By the 1920s, another attempt was made, this time by a commission of 3 musicologists under the supervision of a bishop. They worked together, each taking turns with the pen. When one faltered, another would continue. The idea was simple. If the melody overwhelmed a single hand, perhaps 3 could sustain it. But the experiment failed. All 3 notebooks end the same way. Lines cut short, notes halted mid-stroke, pens abandoned. And worse, each handwriting sample shows the same change. It begins in the unique style of the writer, and then over time, all 3 bend toward the same warped script, the same curve, the same slant, as if another hand had begun to write through them. Archivists noticed this. They compared the final pages, overlaying them against one another. The distortions matched exactly, stroke for stroke, as though a single person had finished them all. But no one had. After this, the archive was locked again. The bishop declared the project concluded. He described the melody in a single sealed letter. It is a hymn not meant for mortal notation. The paper itself recoils. Even so, whispers persisted. Staff members reported that when they handled the seal files, they felt resistance. Not weight, not texture, but resistance, like the page strained against their fingers. Some described hearing faint scratching, as though the lines of music continued to write themselves long after the ink had dried. And one archivist, years later, admitted privately to a colleague that she had tried, just once, to finish a fragment. The file showed a series of unfinished notes, She thought it a clerical oversight. She sat with pen in hand, steadying herself to mark the next bar. But when she touched the page, her wrist jerked. The ink streaked across the staff. The quill snapped in half, and she dropped it, shaking. Her words in confession were simple. It was not mine. Today, those files remain locked, not because they are lost, but because no one wishes to hold them anymore. In the catalog, their titles are all identical. Transcription attempt, no page complete, no line resolved. And yet, even sealed, they remain. A melody unfinished, but not forgotten. The archivists say the files are growing brittle, edges curling, ink darkening with time. But when asked why they refuse to copy them into digital form, the answer is always the same. Because the hand does not belong to us. The boxes stay closed, the shelves stay locked, and still, behind those doors, there lingers the weight of something unwritten, something that waits to be finished. The crypt had been sealed for decades. A heavy stone door, bolted in iron, left to sink into the damp soil of the hillside. Vines had grown over cracks. Moss clung to its edges like a shroud. Most believed it would never be opened again, but nothing stays sealed forever. In the early years of the internet, curiosity became currency, and by the late 2010s, it became entertainment. Urban exploration channels grew by the hundreds. The darker the place, the more attention it drew. The older, the better. The more forbidden, the more people watched. It was only a matter of time before someone went looking for the crypt, and they found it. Two young men, both in their 20s. Their names were never officially released, though online communities quickly pieced together fragments. Aliases, usernames, scraps of dialogue from old videos. What mattered was not their identity, but their decision. They wanted to go live. The crypt of St. Marcellus had been fenced, its gates welded shut, but explorers rarely respected borders. They came prepared with cameras, LED rigs, external batteries, enough to stream the entire night. At first, their audience numbered in the dozens, then hundreds. Then, as the title of the stream spread, inside the sealed crypt, the number swelled into the thousands. The footage begins slow. A handheld light moves across the stone door, its carvings eroded by time. The lens lingers on the iron bolts, rusted but unbroken. One of the men laughs, breath visible in the cold air. The other, quieter, runs his gloved hand across the surface. He whispers something, his microphone faint, almost inaudible. But something wasn't right. The camera adjusts. For just a moment, the carvings, lines that should have been weathered into nonsense, appear to form a pattern. Curved strokes, angles, something like notation. Not music written, but suggested. And then the stream continues. It takes them 20 minutes to force the door. Metal grinds. Stone shifts. The sound is brutal in its violence. And when the gap is wide enough, both men squeeze inside. The chat explodes with comments. Emojis of skulls. Warnings. Jokes. Demands for better lighting. The explorers respond with nervous laughter. They descend the first steps. Their lamps sweep across the walls. Moisture drips. The stone is sweating. Their footsteps echo. The sound is hollow, deeper than it should be. One of them remarks that it feels like being inside a lung. The stream's connection stutters, then stabilizes. The audience number climbs past 8,000. The crypt reveals itself in pieces. First, the narrow corridor, lined with alcoves carved into the rock. Then, deeper down, a widening chamber. Viewers type fast in the scrolling chat. Bones. Skulls. Shadows. The camera lingers on fragments of rotted wood, collapsed coffins, the remnants of names once etched into plaques. And then the central nave. Wide. Dark. Almost cathedral-like, though underground. Candles, long dead, stood melted onto stone ledges. The explorers sweep their lights across the vaulted ceiling. Black streaks mark the surface. Burn scars, the evidence of fire. But something else draws their focus. The floor, carved into the stone, faint but unmistakable, is a circular pattern, geometric, symmetrical, like a wheel. They don't recognize it, but their audience does. Dozens of viewers type the same word. Music. It looks like a score. Not notes, but shapes. Repeating. Rotating. One explorer bends down, tracing the grooves with his hand. He laughs again, though his voice is strained. He says it feels like the stone is warm. And that's when he heard it. Not through the chamber. Not through the air. But through the headphones. The live stream catches it faintly, almost buried in static. A tone, then another, like voices but far away. The chat erupts. Do you hear that? Turn up your mic. It's kids. The explorers don't acknowledge it. Their voices overlap, nervous, trying to fill the silence. One jokes about finding treasure. The other swears they should keep moving. The audience number spikes again. 10,000. 12. The camera swings, unsteady. It points at the rear of the crypt, and in the shadows, there is a smaller chamber, a kind of apse. Within it, benches, wooden decayed, but still aligned, rows upon rows. Like pews, the explorers approach, and the sound grows stronger. The stream audio wavers, cuts, then returns. And beneath their voices, beneath the scuff of boots on stone, comes a distinct rise of a choir. High, thin, fragile, children's voices. But the explorers are alone. The chat floods. Thousands type the same thing. Choir. Singing. Children. The explorers freeze. Their lamps sweep across the pews. Nothing. Only rot and shadow. Yet the sound continues. A hymn. Slow. Repetitive. A melody with no end. One explorer whispers, asking if the other hears it. But the second doesn't answer. The camera angle shifts, unsteady, falling to the side. The screen tilts, catching the rough stone wall, the faint glint of water pooling in cracks. And then silence. The live stream freezes. The video cuts to black. Tens of thousands are left staring at a blank feed. Comments still pouring in. Viewers insisting the sound hadn't stopped, even after the image was gone. The platform later removed the stream, but fragments survived. Screen recordings, audio rips, low-quality copies circulated across forums. Enough for researchers, enough for families. Because when the audio was cleaned, amplified, separated, one thing became clear. The choir was not random. It was organized, layered, trained, a song performed by children, and families began to recognize the voices. Not all, but some, enough to matter. Names were spoken, names of children buried in 1879. The lost choir, mothers and grandmothers, long-aged, wept when they heard it. Fathers who had carried grief their entire lives said they knew those voices. And for the first time in a century, the parish confronted an impossible question. If the crypt had been sealed, if no one had entered for decades, whose voices were still singing, the explorers were never found. Authorities searched the site. The door had been resealed, this time by the police themselves. The live streamer's equipment was discovered inside. A tripod, a bag of batteries, a single camera, but not their bodies. The footage recovered from the camera showed little. Just minutes of shaky light, walls, shadows, then distortion. The audio file, however, was worse because it did not end. Hours after the stream had cut, after the image was gone, the audio recorder kept running, and the choir continued, not fading, not weakening, but steady, endless, a melody without resolution. Families who listened claimed it had no beginning either. The song seemed to loop, to fold back on itself, as though time within the crypt moved differently. Archivists attempted to transcribe, it stopped mid-page. Handwriting faltered, notes slanting into shapes that were not letters. Several abandoned the project entirely. One admitted the music stayed with him in silence, playing even when no sound existed. He described it in one line, a song that waits for a throat to carry it. No official record was released, no transcript, only the silence of an unfinished file. And yet, the audio remains online, not in full, never complete, but fragments circulate, clipped, re-uploaded, buried in strange corners of the internet. And each time it appears, new voices claim recognition. A name here, a word there, faces remembered from photographs. Children buried more than a century ago. The song returns, always incomplete, always unfinished, but still alive, still waiting. Understood. You want chapter 9. The choir without a conductor fully expanded into a long-form script in the Liturgy of Fear style at 260 words in one single message. This will be a long, carefully paced script. Cinematic narration, slow burn unease, and grounded psychological horror. I'll write it as if it's meant for professional voiceover narration, with natural pauses and cliffhanger ending. Here we go. The footage begins in silence. A dim, grainy frame. The crypt's arch ceiling just barely lit by the camera's dying battery. The stone looks wet, though no water is visible. At first, the analyst thought it was interference, but then the sound rose. A choir. High, layered, fragile. The notes carried with them a weight that seemed out of place for the empty chamber, a swell that did not fit the visual stillness. And the strangest part was the order. The music was not chaotic. It was structured, precise. Pauses came at the right moments. Harmonies rose and fell together, not randomly, but as if guided, as if trained. But there was no one there. The crypt remained empty, and still the music built. One by one, the specialists were brought in. Ethnomusicologists, acoustic engineers, priests with experience in Gregorian chant. Even skeptics who believed the audio had been manipulated by the explorers before their disappearance. Each listened. Each tried to explain. None could. The harmonies were clean. The entrances exact. Sopranos lifting at the right measure. Basses holding a note like they were taking a breath in unison. The sound curved, folded, and waited at intervals, the way a conductor's hand might hold the air before releasing the voices again. But there was no conductor. Only silence on the tape between each rise. And yet, the choir obeyed. A musicologist from Florence was the first to put words to the unease. He leaned back from the speakers, shaking his head as if refusing something only he could hear. "They're waiting," he said softly. The others looked at him. Waiting for what? His answer came reluctantly. For someone to arrive. The recording was played again, louder this time, and when the sound reached its first swell, something new became clear. The voices seemed to leave space. Not silence, but space, as though anticipating another voice that never came. A missing part, a hole in the fabric of the melody, and that absence became louder than the sound itself. Technicians mapped the frequencies. They showed visual diagrams of the rising sound. Peaks, valleys, plateaus of volume. What disturbed them was the symmetry. Each voice seemed to correspond perfectly to another. Sopranos rising as altos fell. Tenors layering above basses. A construction too balanced to have been random. One analyst said it was like staring at the skeleton of a cathedral. Every arch held by another. Every beam supporting the next. But in the center, a void. A shape left unfilled. Those who listened long enough reported something else. A sensation not of hearing the choir, but of being heard by it, as if the music bent itself around the listener, shaping itself to their breath, following the rhythm of their pulse. Several wrote in their reports that they felt the music waiting for their response, like a question unasked, like an invitation. But something wasn't right. The explorers who made the recording never appeared in the footage. Not once. No shadow of movement. No body stepping into the frame. And yet the audio contained their voices. Or what families claimed were their voices. The mothers and fathers swore it. The notes belonged to their children. Children who had died in 1879. The resemblance was uncanny. Some even said they could pick out individual timbres. The soft rasp of a boy who had once sung alto. The breathy soprano of a girl who had stood in the front row of the parish choir. The experts dismissed it as grief, as projection, but the families didn't. They wept as they listened, because the children were still singing. The recordings were transcribed, but each attempt broke down the same way. Half-finished notations, measures scratched out, lines abandoned mid-bar, and when questioned, the archivist gave the same explanation. Their handwriting had begun to falter. The notes refused to stay on the staff. They curved upward, bent at impossible angles, as if their hand had been taken and pulled towards something they could not see. One wrote, "It was like writing with someone else's wrist inside my own." In time, the analysis shifted from music to psychology. Why had so many reacted the same way? Why did every expert, no matter how skeptical, come away unsettled? The answer seemed to lie not in the sound itself, but in its shape, the pauses, the crescendos, the unfinished space. It was music designed to include the listener, a choir incomplete without the one hearing it. And the realization began to gnaw. Who was supposed to complete it? One night, an engineer remained in the archive after hours. He had promised to make one last frequency chart. When security found him the next morning, the chart was gone. His pencil lay broken in two, and on the paper before him was not notation, but a series of marks, jagged, inhuman, lines that curved like mouse mid-song. The guard asked if he was all right. The man wouldn't answer. He simply covered the page with his hand, whispering, "It isn't finished." The committee overseeing the investigation suspended all further transcription attempts. The tapes were sealed, and in the report that followed, the conclusion was simple. The choir sang as if awaiting someone who never arrived. But they never said who, and they never asked if the waiting had ended. For weeks afterward, those who worked in the building claimed to hear faint sounds from the storage vault. Not loud, not constant, but waiting, a phrase half-sung, an intake of breath just before release, and then silence. Late one evening, a junior archivist admitted something he had kept to himself. Each time he passed a vault, he felt his own breathing fall in time with the rhythm, as though the air itself was counting, holding, waiting for him to join in. He refused to go back. And yet the recordings remain, unfinished, incomplete, a choir without a conductor, still rising, still waiting for the hand that never comes. And that is where the record ends. But the silence that follows does not. The forest presses close. Pines lean inwards, their tops swaying in windless air, as though listening. A narrow path cuts through undergrowth, pale with frost, littered with brittle needles that crack softly underfoot. The crypt lies somewhere behind those trees. But you don't have to find it anymore, because the sound comes to you. In 2022, the diocese sealed the site for the last time. Heavy locks, iron gates, poured concrete. Nothing more was supposed to pass through those walls. And yet, hikers began to report a melody. At first, faint, like wind pushing unevenly through branches. A suggestion of a note, stretched thin, gone before it was certain. Most ignored it. A trick of sound in the woods. But some stopped, turned, listened closer. And that's when they realized the song was not random. It had rhythm. It had breath. It had memory. The fragments never repeated themselves the same way twice. Sometimes a single line of a hymn clipped short. Other times, only a rising chord that failed to resolve. And sometimes just silence, followed by something impossible. Voices layered on voices, echoing from no direction and every direction at once. But something wasn't right. People who heard it and tried to follow along said it felt natural, even easy. They'd hum under their breath, tracing the invisible line of the melody as it swayed through the branches. They never noticed when they stopped. Hikers who came back from those trails insisted they hadn't been humming at all. Yet friends beside them remembered it clearly. The low sound of lips moving, vibrating, keeping pace with something no one else could hear. The further they walked, the longer the tune seemed to pull itself. And then it was gone. What remained was a kind of pressure in the chest, a strain, like having held breath too long, and always a silence afterward that seemed heavier than sound itself. One man, a schoolteacher, described it like this: "It's as if the song ends inside you, not around you. You wait for the last note to fade, but it doesn't. It lodges there, and you carry it out with you." He never went hiking again. The report spread slowly, whispered between locals, then repeated in online forums. The patterns of the stories matched. Short bursts of hymnal fragments, Sudden pauses, the overwhelming urge to hum along. But there was one detail no one seemed to notice at first. The endings. The endings were never the same. One woman described how the final note plunged, dropping suddenly like a voice cut short. Another swore she heard it linger, suspended midair until her ears buzzed. A third said it ended with a child's voice high, almost too high, straining past the threshold of human hearing. And then came the warnings. Do not hum with it. Do not echo what you hear, because you will not notice when the sound stops. And if you keep humming after the forest has fallen quiet, it means you're singing something else. The locals say it simply. If you answer back, it knows you. The path near the crypt grew emptier. Campers stopped using it. Bird watchers avoided the trees. But still, the reports came in. Families walking dogs late at dusk. College students daring each other to go near the locked fence. Runners who swore they'd only taken that path once. Every story the same. A sound too fragile to be real. A song waiting for a voice to complete it. The diocese denied it. Said the gates held. Said the voices of the past could not cross the seal. But privately, files show their own security staff refused to patrol there after sunset. One guard wrote only 2 words in his resignation. Not empty. And yet, the strangest detail is not in the reports. It is in the silence between them, because no recording exists. Phones carried into those woods die without warning. Batteries drained, files corrupted. One hiker uploaded footage of trees bending in the wind. Yet when he replayed at home, there was no movement at all. The branches were still. His own voice could be heard faintly humming, but he has no memory of making a sound. That is the nature of this last note. It does not end. It moves on. Through the trees, through the voices of those who carry it, through silence itself, and maybe through you, because once you have heard of it, you'll begin to notice quiet places are not truly quiet. The pressure in your chest when the room is still, the way your breath stumbles, as though searching for a rhythm that isn't there, the way you sometimes hum to yourself without meaning to. The forest knows this. The crypt waits, and the hymn has no final measure. It never begins the same way. It never ends the same way. And if you hum along, even once, you may not notice when the trees fall silent. And that is when the song is no longer outside you. It is inside, waiting, and it will not stop. It never stopped. It never will. Faith can silence a hymn, but never erase it. What is buried does not rest. It waits to be remembered. Soft clothesline. And if you hear a song without a singer, do not hum along.